Fantastic. I feel like my mic to switch on. I feel like I also need to thank the speaker, even if they're virtual and not in the room. We're now going to move on to our final panel of today about informing people-centered policies. It is incredibly important, especially in this day and age, when so many policies are perhaps informed by the wrong things without the right people in mind. So, to talk to us a bit about that, I'm going to do the usual thing of introducing our panelists, who will come and take their seats, and then our IGA expert. So our first panelist is Geraldine Barry. Geraldine is the Equality Coordinator at the Joint Research Centre at the European Commission. Her work involves implementing strategy for improving equality, which is something I know we want more of. You can pick whichever seat you like. And Geraldine is also a founding member of the Brussels arm of the organisation Women for Election. So let's give her a round of applause. So yeah, welcome and thank you. And next up, we have Professor Riley Marling from the University of Tartu in Estonia. So Riley specializes in English studies, things such as the conceptualization of gender in a post-socialist context. Interestingly, international travels of gender and feminist theory, which we were just talking about in the speaker room, and also representations of gender in modern and contemporary literature. Pleasure to have you with us, Riley. Round of applause. And our third panelist is Uzoamaka Anita Asegbu. Uzoamaka is a gender and disability inclusion specialist who focuses on inclusive representation and intersections of disability. Uzoamaka has done some amazing work and worked with fantastic organizations such as the United Nations and, very impressively, was nominated in 2023 for the Young Woman of Europe Award. Uzoamaka, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for being here today. Round of applause. And as always, we want to make sure that we have our IGA perspective, so I'm going to be introducing a researcher from IGA to kick things off. Please give a warm welcome to Irene Riobor.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to open this session on such a interesting and transformative topic. A people-centered policy approach starts by understanding who people are, what their needs are, and how these people experience the world differently. This approach lies at the heart of inclusive policies, such as the current gender equality policy, gender equality strategy, which commits to leave no one behind and achieve a gender-equal Europe for everyone. So to inform policies effectively, we need high-quality data and evidence to address the different realities that women and men live. We need high-quality data and evidence on how sex and gender interacts with other grounds of discrimination, such as age, sexual orientation, migration background, and many other grounds. So to continue highlighting the importance of this disaggregation, I want to mention that it's essential to analyze how different factors shape the lives of women and men, and how many of these different factors increase the inequalities between women and men within different population groups. Fortunately, the awareness on the importance of this data disaggregated at different levels has increased in the last decades. And also we have seen important improvements and promising developments. However, there are critical challenges that still persist and need to be mentioned and need real urgent attention. So let's talk a bit about those challenges. The first one that I want to mention is the persistent absence of regularly disaggregated data in certain areas. For instance, we still have problems having sex disaggregated areas, sex disaggregated data, even if sex is a core variable in official statistics. We can talk about many examples, but one that is quite recurrent is the data on behaviors that usually is based on the household surveys. So data on consumption or data on income sometimes, or frequently I could say, is not even disaggregated by sex, is provided at household level. The second challenge is the limited analysis and dissemination of disaggregated data. Even in those cases where this granularity really exists, these breakdowns exist, it is often underused for several reasons. One very common reason is the tendency to talk in general terms using aggregates instead of data breakdown by different population groups. Another reason is that disaggregate data reduce sample size, meaning that when we get responses from surveys and we started to analyze those responses and breaking the data by the sex of the respondent, age, country, and other individual characteristics, many times we end up with such a small group of people that our results cannot be considered reliable. And this leads me to the third aspect that I want to mention, because frequently data producers face resource limitations that impede them from investing in the tools and in the capacities needed for advanced data disaggregation. At EIGE, we work addressing these challenges using an intersectional perspective in all the steps of our work, following in this way an existing internal strategy on strengthening the intersectional approach. In our work, we enhance the gender and the intersectional perspective by the improvement of data collection and dissemination, the development of tools and methodologies, the research with intersectional perspective, and the cooperation with you and international working groups on this topic. So let's give some examples of our activities in these 4 areas of action. Regarding the first action, in our own surveys, such as the gender-based violence survey or the care survey or the platform work survey, we include questions about individual characteristics that allow us to run an intersectional analysis. Questions such as family type or migrant background or sexual orientation. And we always review our questionnaires, trying to find a way on how to improve them in this regard. Other example is our data collection on women and men in decision-making, where we are assessing the feasibility to collect data disaggregated not only by sex, but also by age, so disaggregated by sex and age, for members of the European Parliament. Regarding the dissemination, well, we constantly explore ways to apply a consistent approach to present evidence on gender and intersecting inequalities in our publications, in our work. One example is the approach that we follow in the Gender Equality Index report, where the section on main findings and the section for all the chapters on the index domain include heading messages for one vulnerable group. So in this way, we aim to highlight the intersectional perspective in our publications. Another action that I mentioned previously is the development of methodologies and tools. For example, our gender statistic database includes specific sections on intersectionalities. And when we publish new data under those sections, we always assess the policy relevance of addressing gender and intersecting inequalities, the feasibility of their application in the database, and the specific groups of women and men that may be specifically affected by the issue analyzed. In this regard, I want to mention also that this year we have published the second edition of our publication, Quality Considerations for AGES Gender Statistic Database. And in this second edition, we look at evolving trends, and we include guidance on producing gender equality data with an intersectional perspective. Another example that I want to give you under these areas of action is the work on fostering a gender and intersecting perspective in EU foresight, which explains how to incorporate this perspective into foresight at different stages of the EU policy cycle. Finally, one more example is the publication on the methodology of the domain of intersecting inequalities in the Gender Equality Index. So in that report, we analyze how the different disaggregations that we made are analyzed, and how these disaggregations, disability, type of family, level of education, country of origin, and age, how they intersect with gender. All these efforts that I've mentioned allow us to apply a gender and intersectional approach in our research, and to highlight how overlapping inequalities manifest in different contexts. So you can see in this slide different publications of our annual reports for monitoring the Beijing Platform for Action. So you see studies on poverty, gender equality, intersecting inequalities, gender equality in youth, gender equality and disability, and other studies where we apply an intersectional perspective transversally. The last action that I want to mention is our collaboration with EU and international working groups. We actively cooperate with the Commission and with the UNEC, providing technical assistance to develop guidelines on how to collect data on gender and intersecting inequalities. In conclusion, to build a more equal and inclusive society, we must study specific realities of women and men for different population groups, identifying which are the hidden inequalities in order to define and in order to design policies that foster opportunities for all. So let's work together and let's make evidence our guidance, and gender equality and inclusivity our goal. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Irene. That was absolutely just what we needed to hear. And again, the message echoes forth from pretty much every single IGA member of staff we hear from, which is that we need high quality data. And that again means that the problem is twofold. One, it's collecting that data, and the second one is getting people to take that data seriously. So my first question for the panel is that when we're looking at this from a people's policy focused perspective, Do you think the right people are taking this data seriously? Who's perhaps not taking it seriously, and what can we do to change that? And I'm happy to open that up to whoever wants to step in.
Maybe I'll have
a
first go. So, and just to explain a word or two about the JRC. So we do the evidence and policy support, the scientific support for our for the Commission departments, so with various policy DGs. I think one of the issues we face is the data we are provided with. So, and there are a huge range of challenges with that. So part of it is, I think, lack of interoperability of data. You know, we try and collect from across the member states, or we work with Eurostat for this. So lack of interoperability, fragmented data, data just not disaggregated properly, and I think various things, you know, different things in different fields. So ironically, the colleagues in the JRC who work with household data, they were relatively happy compared to my colleagues on the health field, who say that, you know, they really face much, much more of an issue. So I think part of it is getting the issue taken seriously at member state level. You know, our whole mission at the JRC is to provide the best policy support that we can do. But policies there are there to serve people. So we should try and, I think, take account of, you know, the whole of society in what we do.
Absolutely, and that actually links to what Raleigh and I were talking about before this panel started, which is the idea about international travels of gender and feminist theory, and the fact that we can have data or policy or ideology that will work perhaps in one community that might not work in the other. I don't know, would you like to tell us more about that?
Well, yes. Don't give an academic a possibility of talking for an hour.
I'll also give you a time limit.
But I think that, you know, one of the problems that I think we have is that intersectionality has become this buzzword that academics throw around, politicians throw around, and we are thinking much less about implementation than we should, because although we all recognize the fact that there is no average human being, that, you know, there are people with different intersecting identity categories, nevertheless, when you look at the data, they are still about, you know, human beings. And when in prepping for this panel, I looked at, for example, Estonia's situation. So indeed, we have very good data on gender. We have okay data on age and ethnicity, but we have really spotty data on sexuality. Even disability data is limited. And it's because, you know, we have different ways of getting this data. You know, how do we, what things come automatically, what things we need to have special surveys for. The more sensitive the issue, the more complicated it becomes. And so, by all means, AGA does a great job in encouraging local member states to look into these different aspects and try to put high quality, comparable data defined in the same way together, because I think that's one issue that Geraldine also raised, that we kind of need to make sure we are measuring the same thing in different member states.
Absolutely, and that's quite a challenge. It makes me think actually of that very famous quote of Martin Luther King. He spoke about the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Yeah. And I think that when it comes to any sort of data, especially when it's intersectional, lots of people can feel like, oh, we've made progress and that is therefore enough. Jose Marco, what have you got to contribute to this?
Okay, for me, I think I would ride on what you said about intersectionality being a buzzword. As someone who has been in the intersectionality space, diversity and inclusion, I've seen so many cases where people want to further, you know, their company, their organizations with that buzzword, but they are actually not taking the right steps to ensure that, you know, these persons with diverse identities are represented. So I would say, to your question, I would say so many of us are not taking it serious. Even those that feel like, oh, we're doing enough, most of the time they do things or you know, implementations or actions are being taken based on maybe your personal experiences, and then you don't understand that there are other perspectives out there that are not being included. And then sometimes another thing with intersectionality that people don't understand is that intersectionality is not the same thing as, you know, should I say diversity in that regard, where intersectionality is looking at multiple means of discrimination, right? I don't like using myself as an example, but I will do that here, where I am a woman, and we all know that the female gender can be discriminatory in some cases. I'm a woman with disabilities, and then I am in Europe. I am a woman with racial minority, right? So these things, if you're looking at inclusion and you're looking at them separately, you're not really including me. Right, because these three things compound to cause discrimination for someone like me, right? I'm just using myself as an example, but then I'm trying to make us all understand that when you're looking at intersectionality, you have to look at how all these intersectionalities can compound and become a form of discrimination for one person, and not looking at them, separately. So we all have to make the collective effort to take it seriously.
So do you think that's more about changing the type of people we're listening to, or perhaps it's more radical than that, and that's it, changing the way in which we listen?
I think changing the way in which we listen, and not just the listening part, but also changing the way that we bring people in. If you're bringing people with diverse background, you shouldn't bring them for the photo ops or for the good of the image of your organization. No, you should bring them and make sure that their voices are heard. What they are saying is being included, not just for promotion, because I've seen it happen a lot of times. I'm talking from experience. I've seen it happen a lot of times. So we should change the way we bring in people. We should bring in people who have lived experiences of these things, and actually listen to them, listen to their perspectives. It might not align with what you already know. It might come from a different background or something, but actually listen to these people and take their perspectives into active actions and implementations.
Fantastic. Yeah. Go on, Riley.
I just wanted to add that one thing that we might have to also change is what kind of data we take seriously, because the kind of work that intersectionality really requires is very often qualitative. We are looking in depth into very small slices of data, and yet our statistics, I think, fetishize large data sets. And I think that we need to combine these two, that in addition to the large representative surveys, have more qualitative studies that allow us to understand the surveys.
Yeah, maybe I'll feed off that a little bit. Something that we're considering at work, and we have set up a working group at the JRC to really look at the issue of disaggregated data with the aim of providing first guidelines for our researchers and maybe more general guidelines in the academic community after that. And one of the things we are saying is actually it should be a combination of both. You can get some of your hard quantitative data, but when we were considering intersectionality, we were also considering that maybe you don't always get the people to respond to, the surveys or collect the data easily, and maybe it's actually better to have this qualitative approach and really combine the two.
In particular, for understanding how the intersections happen, because I think that tends to get lost in the large data sets.
Yeah, and in fact, while you were speaking, I was thinking, actually much of what you were saying relates to democracy and engagement and how we listen to people and engage. So it's a much broader message than simply data, getting the best data.
Can I?
Yeah, of course, please.
Yes, I just want to add to something that you said about, getting people to respond to these, surveys and all that. I think one mistake that we make in that regard is when we're preparing surveys or we're trying to collect data is that we don't look at how accessible it will be for people who are not in the broader group, right? If you're preparing a survey and you're putting the survey online, have you thought about the fact that the website where you're putting the survey is not accessible to blind people or people with visual, disabilities? So look at how to make these data, these surveys or data collection processes accessible so that everyone contributes equally to it, because most of the time we prepare, data collection in the sense that everyone can, what we're putting out there, everyone can access it. And then when we get back, the information that we want, it doesn't really represent many of the people that we need to speak up. So we need to ensure accessibility in that regard.
And maybe, I mean, I was thinking colleagues kind of, or at least the experience of colleagues shared, LGBTIQ colleagues said, they simply would not be comfortable ticking boxes that were, and particularly not in the political climate that, in certain European countries that we have, where they feel, hard-won rights are extremely fragile. So that also was an argument in terms of, a kind of a more qualitative approach in some aspects.
I know some social scientists in academia who could talk about this for a very long time. And these are the considerations that we have to take on board. Is how do we make sure that the data we're gathering is, one, intersectionally fair, and two, presented in a way that is truly accessible. So we spoke a little bit about democracy, buzzwords, and if I were to bring those two ideas together, do we think that we have a problem by which intersectionality is thrown around in political spaces for short-term progress at the expense of long-term change because it's based around the next election, as an example? Just throw that out there. I can see you nodding as well, Marka. Please tell us.
No, I fully agree. I fully agree with that. Where people, like I said before, people try to use intersectionality for their personal gains, giving hope to people, and at the end of the day, not looking at the consequences of what they did, to these people. One place I could use that for is in terms of job provisions, where people are hired on, short-term basis and all that, to I don't know, to feed political progression of somebody else, and at the end of the day, when the person gets what they want, the people that were hired will be thrown out and all that. So I think it's something that the people who are perpetrating this, they need to consider that they are actual human beings at the back of what is whatever gain you're having. There are people who suffer these consequences, people who got some sort of hope from the promises that you made, and we need to really speculate on that.
Absolutely. Do either of you have anything on that?
Well, I would just maybe add a different facet to the same point, which is that when we play around with intersectionality, we need to make sure that the most fragile populations don't fall through the cracks, that we don't say, hey, we can talk about white men and their intersectional problems because they live in rural areas, right? So we need to, at the same time, maintain an awareness of the need to still think of the groups that tend to vanish from the perspective otherwise if we're not intersectional.
And also accepting that the most vulnerable will often be the most silent.
Exactly, yes, exactly.
Okay, I'm going to let our panelists have a little breather. You can rest your throats. I'm going to call on another speaker from the floor, but this time going to come onto the stage. It's going to be very exciting. So we have a microphone ready up. So I am going to invite to the stage Illyriana Vanska. So Illyriana is the program manager for an organization, oh, she's got a mic, sorry, for Women, Inc., a gender specialist with over 10 years of experience. And Illyriana, I would love for you to tell us all here today, what is it that Women, Inc. does?
It feels a bit awkward standing in front of you guys
You can-
and
okay, you can
showing
sit down
you my
instead.
back. No. It's a pleasure being here. And just as I was sitting there and listening to you, I thought about what I had prepared, and then I completely forgot because the conversation was so interesting. So I'm going to just start with my first kind of like reflections on what you said.
Go for it.
Yeah, except for obviously the recurring theme today, collecting more data is important. I think we need to get one step before that, especially when it comes to intersectionality. Which data do we actually collect? As in, which intersections do you want to gather? There's so much power in the decision that you make as data gatherers when you decide those intersections and for which endpoint. So we need to be reflective on that and always check ourselves on which intersections you want to actually gather, because data is power in that regard. I'm a program manager at Women Inc. It's a Dutch-based organization that has been active in the field of gender equality for roughly 20 years now. Similarly to IGA, we are active in the fields of health, money, work, and gender stereotypes. And speaking of intersectionalities, we try to combine these domains as well, to not see them as separately, because mental health issues have, for example, effects on your labor participation. So we always in our work also try to connect these domains and see how they interact each other and influence each other when it comes to equal rights and equal opportunities. Yes, so intersectionality has been on our agenda for a very long time. No surprise to you. In Holland, there's a lack of data as well when it comes to how different identity markers and intersections actually have effect on equal opportunities of people in the Netherlands. Even so, to bridge that gap, we do our own research and try to bring in the different intersections that are important to that topic. And interestingly, we usually work with external research institutions, and we more often than not also quite hear the response that those institutions actually don't have access to the particular population that we are interested in. And let's say, for example, we are interested in doing research on the labor participation of women with a migrant background and disabilities. More often than not, we hear that they don't have actual access to that population to be able to do the survey. So to match your point, what you said earlier as well, the accessibility to specific research populations is very important in that regard. So what we did do is establish our own council of experts of lived experiences, as we call them. It's a council now constituting of 20 people who we have gathered to join us in our efforts to increase gender equality in the Netherlands. These are people that come from different organizations in the Netherlands that they have specific knowledge and expertise on a particular intersection. So, for example, we have organizations that really focus on women with mental or physical disabilities. We have an organization that primarily focuses on women, plus populations. We have an organization that focuses primarily on women in the labor market and with a cultural background that is not Dutch. And we bring these people together to, besides gathering our quantitative data, to in a qualitative manner speak to them on a recurring basis. And whatever we discuss, we as Women Inc., we take it into our strategies. We let it, so it has impact on what we do, what type of actions we take, what kind of programs, strategic programs we develop, and the lobby that we do. So through us, we take those intersections and we bring that to the forefront in the hopes that policies actually get to change and be informed.
Wow.
And I want to add something to that as well, because more often than not, I've been active in the field of gender mainstreaming as well in a past life. I've always argued that gender mainstreaming is not a leftist intellectual exercise. It's actually an exercise to make policy more effective. Similarly, taking intersectionality into policies is exactly that as well. It's not an intellectual exercise, it's an actual way to increase the effectiveness of public spending, to make your policies more effective, and in turn also actually cut your spending on policies that don't work because they take a one-size-fits-all approach.
That's fascinating. It's interesting that you said that lots of people view it as being a political matter, but ultimately we want to make sure that intersectionality is taken seriously by people all across the political spectrum. And perhaps part of that is that we have a problem by which people don't understand exactly what intersectionality is. And even in the people who do advocate for it, lots of people, am I right in thinking, don't understand the multifaceted nature that it can take?
Yeah, and I agree to what was said before as well. More often than not, intersectionality is seen as an endpoint rather as a process. And as an individual who tries to include intersectionality in the work that we do, I constantly also have to check my own privilege and my own preconceived notions of what is emancipation. So, for example, through the work that I've done and the conversations I had with diverse people, I've noticed that not everyone in the field of emancipation or women's rights, for example, primarily identifies as a woman. A person might primarily identify with their ethnic background, for example, and we have to take that into consideration and check our own privilege and check our own notions of what is the next step into emancipation in order for intersectionality to actually be effective.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to some questions for our panelists. Are you feeling prepared? Yeah, they look prepared. So we can take questions. We'll start off with questions from the people in the room. I'm going to check the Slido. If you're listening online, you can submit your questions, and I will try to pass those on. So, should we start off with people in the room? Has anyone got a question for our panelists based on what we have heard so far? If not, I will go to the Slido question. And it is a question for Iger. So, Irene, I might have to look at you. And they say, what is Iger's definition of intersectionality? And is it different from analysing intersecting inequality by quantitative data? Irene is now looking at me thinking, why did you pick that question? Well, perhaps what I could do is I could tell you the panel, like, you know, how would you define intersectionality? If someone came up to you and said, what do you mean by this? What's the definition that you guys would give?
For me, okay. Intersectionality means looking at the experiences of life, human experiences, from diverse perspectives, and not just diverse perspectives on a separate angle, right? Looking at multiplying these looking at how these diverse perspectives could multiply the experiences of oppression or the experiences of privilege, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry that I have to use that as an example, but
okay.
Yeah. Okay. So recently I did a session on intersectionality for my organization, and I had to do this I had to help people to check their privilege and check, their oppression and all that. And a man, and a white man at that, could have multiple forms of privilege, right? The privilege, let's use Europe as an example, the privilege that a man, because we are here at the Gender Equality Forum, if a man and a woman had the exact same privilege, we wouldn't be here, right? We won't be having all these conversations we'll be having today. So that's the thing. Intersectionality, from the privilege aspect, you could have more than one intersecting identity that could increase your privilege. You could also have more than one intersecting identity that could increase your discrimination or oppression. So that's how I view intersectionality.
I would just add, as somebody who has spent decades trying to make everything complicated very, very simple, and I like Mary Matsuda's recommendation of asking the other question, so that when you look at race, you also ask, is that class? You look at disability, you want to ask, is this has something to do with education? So that you kind of acquaint yourself with a habit of going beyond one category of either privilege or discrimination, for example.
Yeah, and I would just say it's the interplay of various factors, building on what has been said. So income, equality, or inequalities, what do you face? And not being overly simplistic in jumping to conclusions.
And I think that, for many people, that thing that I said about buzzwords is that they don't see it tangibly playing out in their own life very often. But for example, in Estonia's case, in the most recent analysis of the PISA, the educational tests that rank countries, and everybody gets very excited because we do well in that test. And one of the things that was found out is that the greatest predictor of the high scores is the mother's educational level. And that made people really interested. That was the greatest predictor, and all of a sudden you could see people who would never say intersectionality get very interested. So.
Very good. I was just thinking, would it be fair to say we could define it as people who fall through the gaps because of our use of fixed definitions?
Sorry, could you say that again?
So people who fall through the gap because of our use of fixed definitions or labels.
Yes. Okay, that could work.
But I would maybe rather our attempt to simplify people to a single definition.
Yeah.
That we are more complicated, and usually statistically or governance-wise, it's easier to deal with us by one characteristic. But ultimately, that's not how we are as human beings.
True.
Absolutely. And one of the problems is, especially when you have these conversations with people who might be more privileged, is that you can find that you're sometimes met with a very defensive attitude.
Right.
And obviously that's something that we need to think about. How can we overcome it to have that conversation in a way that is truly productive as opposed to polarizing? So I was wondering, what advice would you have for anyone who is approaching this conversation to do it in a way that is unifying rather than dividing?
I think I would simply say we're about providing evidence for policies, and we're trying to do it in the best way possible, and to bring it down to that level. It's not, it's not about I don't know, being on trend, or it's simply trying to take account of the whole of society when we're providing the scientific support that we should be providing. And maybe a simple example of that is, I don't know, energy poverty. You know, who is most affected by that? What categories? How can they be helped? I don't think it's usually down to also how a policy is applied in different contexts.
And I would probably add to this that very often intersectionality is equated with certain axes of difference that are very polarizing. Sexuality, race, class, and it is sometimes helpful to bring in the things people don't notice, like disability, like educational attainment, like regional belonging, geopolitical differences, the things that even people who would get defensive about some of those more political aspects would recognize as being part of their life.
Okay, for me, I think one way we can do it is we should understand, especially if you're in a position of privilege, when people who are who are not in the same position as you are speaking about the discrimination that they face, and you understand that you could be benefiting from the privilege. You should understand that they are not complaining about you. They are speaking about their experiences, right? I've been in places where I'm talking about my own discrimination and somebody's trying to, I'm like, I'm not talking about you. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Everybody deserves to have privilege. The fact that I'm talking about my discrimination doesn't mean that you shouldn't have your privilege. You're a human being, just that we all deserve equal human rights, right? So I'm not saying privilege should be removed from you. That's one thing, you know, we all have to understand, especially if we're in a position of privilege. When people talk about intersectionality or talk about their lived experiences, they are not attacking you. They are just expressing their feelings and what is happening to them. So if we approach it that way, I'm sure we would have good conversations.
Absolutely fantastic. I'm going to give the floor another opportunity. We have a hand up at the back if one of our flying mics could make its way there. And if you'd just like to let us know who you are, where you're from, and what your question is.
Hi, my name is Li Shu, and I'm a resident of Germany. Thank you so much for your insights, especially I think my question is related to what you have just mentioned, right? So the lived experiences part and how people really express themselves. We're talking a lot today about we need to get more data, we need to get I-do data. Not that I have the data for you, but I feel that in an attempt also to be critical of my own work, I don't want to see people as data. You know, I'm not data. My lived experiences are not data sources for you. So in your own ways, how are you honoring people's lived experiences, no matter it means translating that appropriately into insights or policy advocacy work? How are you, in best practices ways, how are you honoring people's lived experiences so it doesn't get reduced or get lost in the process? Thank you.
It's about how we can keep that human connection. Would anyone like to?
I mean, okay, I was going to say we are all data. We are all providing multiple points of data in our online activities and many other activities throughout our lives. So I don't see that as being a negative in any sense. I think it's just a fact of life. But maybe, I guess the point was, how to honor it, how to take it seriously, and not just be reduced to a data point or something.
Yeah.
No?
How to not forget the human element behind the data, because I think sometimes perhaps we can get a bit too fixated on the data and lose track of the real life implications, perhaps.
I really like this question because, you know, I'm somebody who does qualitative work mostly, and I think that we need to be very, very attentive to research ethics and spend a lot of time on reflexivity on what we're doing and how, including in our data gathering. I have a colleague, for example, who did, in her work, think very carefully about the kinds of groups that she was interviewing, making sure that the men of privilege were made uncomfortable a little bit in a data collection process, whereas the women who did not have that privilege were, accommodated to more so that they would feel comfortable. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily, the panacea that solves many problems, but starting out by thinking about how to open up our participants, how do we make them trust us that we will take good care of the experiences they share, in particular about the stuff that is sensitive, their religious beliefs, the gender and sexual identity, things that really can get them in trouble in some ways. So that's that kind of an ethical foundation should be there in every study. I mean, we should write this section to every paper.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of mishy.
Okay. Do you want to say
no?
I just wanted to say that trust is a huge. I mean, it's important in everything, but I think, particularly in a context like this, it's. I mean, trustworthy data, but trustworthy in the way that it's collected, and treating people with trust. Very important.
Okay, yes, thank you. So for me, an example, currently I'm conducting a research on intersectional discrimination in the workplace for my organization. And one thing I've done to ensure that because it's a qualitative data, one thing I've ensured the people that because I'm conducting interviews, the people I'm interviewing, I allow them to define themselves, right? Most of the time when we're doing research, we tend to have stipulated boxes that people can check, male, female, and all that. But when I'm speaking to somebody, I give them enough amount of time for them to tell me who they are. They define themselves to me, right? And that builds a level of trust, even not just for them, but also to you. You see them as people when you allow them to tell, because what they tell you might not be in your own definition of what you already have as what is data, and then you have to go back and restructure what you've already, the process you've already put down. An example is one of the persons I interviewed. The person, it's an indigenous person from an Asian country. I'm not allowed to say which. So I'm from an Asian country and the person is indigenous. And the person was telling me that they identify as bisexual, right? But then they went on to inform me that they do not belong to LGBTQ community. Because for the indigenous people in their community, they have a different definition of what their sexuality is, and it does not align with the Western world's definition of LGBTQ. But if I didn't allow them to tell me that, I would just automatically group them into LGBTQ because they identified as bisexual, right? So that's one way to ensure that people remain humans when you're collecting data from them. Thank you.
And I think that the key element here is accepting messiness. That you cannot go to the field and accept that you will emerge with clarity that you wrote into your research proposal. Instead, you need to accept the fact that you might come up with something completely different, right?
Different, yes.
Absolutely. We have time for one or two more questions, perhaps. We've got one here at the front.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marina. I'm a youth activist for non-visible disabilities and mental disorders. And my question is in this direction of labeling as well, more or less. But I'm more interested how you take in your research, how do you take in accountability of PTSD or possible traumas or everything like that? Because I feel like in nowadays society, we talk a lot about PTSD, mental health, trauma and so on, but I feel like we are actually less using it as a label or as a tool to get to know people more, and especially that this is a wide nuanced discussion, and I'm really interested because I feel like we could learn more about this, and also each individual, like you already mentioned, and this is something that no matter of what background you have, you might face, unfortunately. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. So it's interesting because actually when we're talking about trauma, you think that sometimes gathering data can also potentially put someone at harm, and that's something that we really need to be thinking with, because intersectionality, as we discussed, there are people who fall through the gaps of the fixed definitions of what we think we can work with. So I was wondering if anyone had any reflections. Marley, I can see.
Yeah, I would just say very quickly that I think that one of the, we need to be very aware of neurodivergence as an issue to just even before we go to trauma, to when we're starting to gather data, what kinds of questions we can ask, what kinds of dialogues we enter into. And I think that's definitely an under-researched dimension right now. Right. 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 Right.
So I'm just going to summarize, because the people online can't hear what you're saying, and there are quite a few, so you take it to like, sorry.
So beside that is under research is also under diagnosticated. Usually we tend to overshadow this angle so much because, okay, we have these statistics, they are not so much, but unfortunately a lot of people don't even know what neurodiversity is, what PTSD is, how it manifests, each of us react to it differently. Even PTSD as a concept is relatively new as a diagnostic. Otherwise, in the past was a mix of other diagnostics. So it's not. You don't have to think about PTSD just like, okay, it's a war and only those people raped, incest, school or house abuse, everything like that can create PTSD at the end of the day. And this is why I feel like in our researches we should also have in mind this and be more human when addressing this type of question, because it's important to not only to normalize it, but also to understand that weird reaction happen for a reason. And you don't have the right to discriminate that person because you don't even know, and maybe even that person doesn't know exactly what is behind, what happened. Because a person with PTSD is not feeling and thinking the same as it was or as you are as a normal person, whatever normal means anyway.
I think that's a very good question, and thank you so much for asking it. And I think it also brings back this idea that views, attitudes, and understandings are constantly changing as society develops. And I think that one of the things that Illyriana said that struck me is that intersectionality is not an end goal. And I think that when you're looking at any of these issues, we have to take into account that our understanding of these various different identities, the way they affect people, the way they affect people differently, is constantly going to change. And obviously that then makes our job of collecting data from a human perspective even more challenging, because even if we get something that works today, it might not work tomorrow.
Yeah, I was searching for a word there, and I think it's holistic. You know, that we need to be much more encompassing when when we're framing research questions, when we're thinking about the data, that we wish to gather. I have it in mind because a colleague has co-authored a very large report that is not yet out, but it's advocating kind of for a one mental health approach within the EU. Some of this work came out as a result of the COVID crisis, but actually her comment to me was, isn't it great that the Commissioner has equality and preparedness in crisis in her title? She could see loads of synergies between the two. But I think it's having a much more holistic and more less maybe categorizing into, as you were saying earlier, don't be defined so easily by by the first characteristic that comes to mind in what we're gathering. It doesn't make it easy.
Yeah. And of course it's an endless task, because we think we have put a band-aid on one thing, and then obviously the band-aid comes off because there's always something else underneath it. And the joy of research is that you can always dig deeper as long as there's funding. But for us, I think in the community here, in the activist community, is also to recognize this as the joy, not just a challenge. That this is an opportunity, not just something that we need to be scared of.
And of course, some people are allergic to the Band-Aid.
Yes.
For me, I agree with everything you both have said. I also believe that as researchers or people collecting data, especially if the data you're collecting, it has a bit of trauma, or the previous panel where we talked about violence and harassment and all that. I think is one thing we should try as much as possible to provide is some sort of support for the people that are participating in this data collection, right? Most of the time, because people that face trauma or that face violence or anything of any sort, any violence of any sort, it takes them a while to get to their healing point, or sometimes they put the band-aid on. And you as a researcher, most of the time, because you need concrete data, you need something tangible, right? You keep probing and probing, and you rip the band-aid off, or you take them back to wherever it is that they healed from, and then you leave them stranded, right? So as researchers, as organizations, we should try to make collective efforts to ensure that we provide the support. Some might not know, you let the people know that, oh, there's support available if you need one. We provide support for them in case they have a reaction, in case they need it, or in case they just want to share or something like that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Do we have perhaps time for one or two more questions from the floor? Four questions, Femi says. Okay. As long as you tell me when you want us to stop. So I'm going to ask you, I've had some experience working in political offices, but also some experiences working in universities, and I know that we have both represented here. Do you think there's a significant difference in attitudes generationally towards intersectionality? And if so, what can we potentially learn or take away from that?
I think that I'll just take the first answer as this is simple, obviously, is the answer. In academia, everything comes in generations. The way we were raised influences the way in which we start asking questions. To some generations, you need to first argue for intersectionality. For some people, this is the obvious thing to begin from. So,
I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I think there's a backlash, actually, particularly among younger men, being very, hostile and, let me just say hostile. And this came, I remember at the beginning of this year, a colleague shared their experience we have an equality group at the JRC. And in fact, this exact question, they'd done a survey. It was actually the Egalités, the interinstitutional LGBTIQ network, shared the results of a survey, and somebody said, "Oh, I guess there's much more understanding among the younger generation than not." And he said, "No." When they broke down the responses, absolutely not. And yeah, in fact, there was probably more empathy and understanding from some of the older respondents in the cohort. And I think this has been played out through society a little bit, as we've seen.
And that backlash is phenomenally dangerous and needs to be dealt with as well. And you think, well, actually, if we're trying to promote this concept across the board, what can we do to make sure that, one, we don't have as much of a backlash, and two, the people who do become extremely defensive still have an opportunity to come on board with intersectional thinking?
Okay. Yes. I think to an extent, apart from the age, clashing, to an extent, as someone who has been in academia and who has been in, the organizational side of things, I think there's a little bit of clash, or huge, I don't know how to define it, but there is some sort of clash where, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I've seen some sort of clash where, especially on gender issues, where people in academia feel like people in organizations, do not necessarily understand the theory of gender equality, while the people in organizations feel like they are actually in the field doing the work, so academia doesn't do much. I've seen I've seen that. I did my master's in women and gender studies, so and then I've worked with organizations on women's issues, so I've seen that clash. But I think in that regard, there should be a collaboration between the two. one part is bringing the theory and one part, they can't, if you're putting the practices, there's a theory behind it. If you're doing the theory, there has to be a practical, aspect of it. The clash is not meant to be there. It's time for collaboration among the two. Then in terms of age, I think one thing, especially as a young person and for my fellow young people, we are too eager to cancel, the cancel culture that is currently, we have this cancel culture where, especially for we don't give grace to the older generation. We are too eager to condemn them because, they have ideas that we necessarily do not understand. So I think this is one thing we have to specifically talk about as young people. We need to put a pause to the council, at least give some sort of grace to understand, because the gender equality fight, the feminist fight has been going on for decades, for centuries, and there are people that were doing it before us. So as a young person, you didn't start it, right? You didn't start it, somebody started it. And if these people had a method that was working for them, and you feel like that method is no longer working, learn from their method and, align it with your own method and then make it work.
I wanted to go to add something to the polarization topic. I think that one of the issues that, because that is a very serious problem for all people working on gender and inclusivity in general, and I think the most important element is to make people who are so easily frightened by stuff like this see that they are not going to lose from it. Yeah. That it is for them too important to understand the intersectional differences that have created the ontological insecurity that is being so strongly exploited by different divisive political forces. So bring them back.
Absolutely. I think there's a very strong message that needs to be heard, is that gender equality, intersectionality is a cause for all humanity. Yeah. It's not that certain groups that will benefit more, it's that humanity as a whole benefits if we are all backing it together. Yeah. We had one question here at the front. Was that right, Liliana? Did you put your hand up? Yeah, of course, yeah. There's time. Can we turn the roving mic on, please?
Hi. Yeah.
There we go.
I really wanted to, here I am again, to reiterate that I'm especially when we're talking about how can we, in kind of like a reality of changing political atmosphere and with the backlash that we're seeing from younger generations, as research previously in a previous panel has shown, I'm really an advocate for simplifying and demystifying the concept of intersectionality and really using a language that is understandable for the public that you're preaching it to. An example that I always use is when I had to explain to my father what I do and what intersectionality means, and how my work is geared towards changing policy in an intersectional way. I gave him the example of the household. I told him, you and my mother make policies for this household to run smoothly. Consider this household as a country that has to have different policies for it to run smoothly. You have 3 different children. One is a boy. You have to take in consideration that he's a boy and he lives in a certain context at school in which he's considered as a boy, and hence rules change for him because he's a boy. He's the eldest, making him have a different character. I'm the middle child, makes me more temperament, makes me more of an advocate. You have to change your parenting style to each of us to make the policies run smoothly in the household. And that's how I explained to him what intersectionality means. It simply means not favoring one over the other or giving the other more privilege than the other. It just means looking at specifically each child, their specific identity markers, and creating policy that makes it effective for them to live in this household. And all of a sudden, my father understood intersectionality. So I just wanted to explain that we really, as a collective here, need to check ourselves on the language that we use and make it more understandable and fit into the reality of the person that you're speaking to. Because again, honestly, intersectionality is just about seeing people in their complexity, and in relation to the panel discussion today and the topic today, and how can policy reflect that so it is more effective and it comes to the people that actually needs it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Liliana. That's an absolute And you touched on a really important point about the language that we're using and how that can sometimes, one, be a genuine mistake, but also there's an increasing issue now of people weaponizing language as a coded weapon. And I was going to ask you all actually about technology as well, because I think that technology is a catalyst for ideological change. Technology means that young people can have this huge ideological shift relating to gender equality or intersectionality very quickly. And when it comes to the perspective of data gathering, surely that's just like a whole new wild card that makes everything difficult. What do you guys have to say about the role of technology in data collection?
Well, I think we're all using, ChatGPT, AI, large language models. They have enormous potential and enormous downsides.
Yeah.
And they are certainly finding their way into research, increasingly, let alone society overall. If I just focus on the research side, I think we have to be careful. We have to acknowledge, we have to realize the bias there. That, even today a colleague just, I don't know, I think we were just saying, let's do a picture of intergenerational fairness. And he said, he was on another screen, he said, oh, I see a lot of men with white hair. And the only thing that's the only gradation there is some have slightly grayer hair, and that's the algorithm. It had completely misunderstood. So huge potential, but a lot of technology. Yeah, what can I say? We're dangerous times.
These dangerous times, especially with young people and access to social media specifically. I was wondering if either of you had.
I'll just make one point about social media and data gathering, that we just need to understand that we have not one public that we are gathering, but in social media in particular you have fractured publics who are all living in very different worlds, and we as academics don't even always know about how to get access to all of these groups. And we need to maintain that mindfulness about the need to catch as much as we can, because right now I think we're losing a lot of it.
Absolutely. Jamaka?
Yeah, I think I think technology can be useful and can also be used to perpetrate, gender inequality. It is very important that when we are using technology, we use it in a way that is ethical, mostly, especially because most of the time it can be used to spread misinformation, and then we've seen so many cases where people, take something that is not true and they amplify it and say it, and at the end of the day, it's what is trending. We shouldn't focus on trends. Sometimes some trends are not true. So we should, whatever we're getting from technology, we need to constantly check and confirm that it is true and it's ethical.
Fantastic. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers, Iliriana, Irene, Uzumaka, Riley, and Geraldine. Please give them a warm